Picture a gymnasium in Westwood, Los Angeles. A Tuesday evening in October 1967. The fluorescent lights hum above a wrestling mat that smells of chalk dust, leather, and decades of competition. 211 pounds of standing start aggression. A man named Carl DeLuca, ranked third in the nation in Greco-Roman wrestling. A man whose forearms alone weigh more than most people's legs, reaches out and seizes a smaller man by the right hand. He grips it the way wrestlers grip things. Total, deliberate, crushing. The kind of grip that says, I have decided what happens next. The smaller man does not flinch. For one suspended second, the room holds everything. All the air, all the sound, all the muscle and history in it. 43 people are in that gym, and not one of them breathes. Then DeLuca is on the floor. He doesn't know how he got there. His knee has buckled. His wrist has rotated somewhere it did not expect to go. The mat rises to meet him before his brain can file the paperwork on what his body just experienced. 2 seconds. One grip. One man standing. One man learning something he could not have learned in any training hall, on any mat, in any of his 17 years of competitive wrestling. The man still standing weighs 138 pounds. His name is Bruce Lee. This is that story. You have to understand what the Westwood Athletic Center was in 1967. It wasn't a public gym. You didn't wander in off the street. The building on Gailey Avenue operated under a private membership system. Coaches, serious competitors, men who trained for national championships and Olympic trials. The front desk kept a handwritten logbook. That Tuesday evening, 43 names were signed in. Among them, 6 former collegiate wrestling champions, 2 judo black belts, and 3 men who had competed at the Pan American Games. This was not a place where amateurs came to play. Carl DeLuca had been a member for 4 years. At 26 years old, he stood 6 feet 2 inches tall and carried 312 pounds of legitimate, functional athletic mass. Not the bloated weight of a man who'd stopped training, but the dense, coiled weight of a man who trained 6 days a week, who had been throwing and pinning men since he was 9 years old in Pittsburgh. His Greco-Roman record at that point was 41 wins, 3 losses, with 28 of those wins by pin. He had placed third at the national championships the previous spring in Stillwater, Oklahoma, with his only loss that tournament coming by decision after 6 hard minutes against the eventual champion. Carl DeLuca was not a bully. He was not a showman. The people who knew him described him the same way. Careful, methodical, patient. He never rushed. He had been trained by coach Emil Vrabel, a Czech emigre who had competed in the 1952 Helsinki Olympics, and Vrabel had built into DeLuca a philosophy of controlled pressure, where the man down, read his weight distribution, find the moment when the weight shifts, and then it's over. DeLuca had applied this philosophy against men larger than himself, stronger than himself, more decorated than himself. He had never lost to anyone who weighed 140 pounds. That Tuesday, DeLuca had arrived at 6:15 in the evening for his standard 2-hour session, 40 minutes of drilling, 20 minutes of live wrestling, 20 minutes of weight work, and then the informal period that regulars called the open mat. When the session officially ended but no one went home, when men stood in small clusters and talked technique, and sometimes, when the mood was right, tested ideas on each other in the loose, exploratory way that serious athletes use to keep their minds sharp. It was during the open mat, around 8:40 p.m., that Carl DeLuca first noticed the smaller man near the far wall. He didn't recognize him immediately. The man was standing with Jimmy Wu, a Chinese-American judo instructor who occasionally trained at the facility. The smaller man was wearing dark slacks and a plain button-down shirt, street clothes, not gym clothes, and he was watching the room the way certain people watch rooms. Not casually, not with the darting attention of curiosity, but with the flat, total awareness of someone who is cataloging everything without appearing to look at anything. DeLuca noticed the stillness first. That was unusual. Most people who stood in that gym for the first time, even serious athletes, showed the room some physical deference. They moved carefully. They watched the wrestlers on the mat with a kind of respectful uncertainty. This man was just still. Jimmy Wu caught DeLuca's eye across the room and gave the slight nod that served as introduction in that world. Someone worth knowing. DeLuca estimated the man at maybe 140 pounds. He was compact, precise in his posture, the kind of stillness that didn't come from nervousness, but from discipline. But 140 pounds was 140 pounds. DeLuca's left forearm, measured at the widest point, was 14 inches in circumference. He had once held a man by the wrist for 4 minutes in a match, controlling the entire bout from that single grip. 140 pounds was simply not a number that registered as a physical threat in Carl DeLuca's operational vocabulary. He was curious, genuinely curious, the way a craftsman is curious about another craftsman's tools. Interested, respectful, but confident in his own calibration. He crossed the gym floor. Bruce Lee was 27 years old that October. He had been in Los Angeles for just over a year, having relocated from Seattle following the unexpected closure of his third martial arts school, a closure that was less a failure than a tactical withdrawal, a man choosing to concentrate his energies rather than disperse them. He was already known in the martial arts community, but known the way underground things are known, with the fervor of the few rather than the recognition of the many. His Hollywood career had produced a handful of television appearances and a recurring role on The Green Hornet, which had premiered just that September. He was not famous. Not yet. What he was prepared. 17 years of daily training prepared, beginning from a moment at 13, when he began studying Wing Chun under Yip Man in Hong Kong. He had cross-trained in boxing, in judo, in fencing, the footwork of fencing particularly, which informed the way he positioned himself, always angled, always one edge or another presented rather than the flat target of a forward stance. He weighed 138 pounds on the scale that morning. His resting heart rate was 52 beats per minute. His 1-inch punch, the controlled distance strike he used in demonstrations, had been measured generating force equivalent to a man 3 times his size, throwing from full extension. Those are numbers on paper. Numbers on paper don't walk into a room. What walked into a room was the quality of his attention. Jimmy Woo would describe it later, in an interview given in 1979, as the feeling of being near a very still body of water. You couldn't tell how deep it was just by looking, and that uncertainty kept you careful. Bruce's hands, at rest at his sides, showed the specific callousing of daily wooden dummy training. The outer edges of both palms, the first 2 knuckles of each fist, the heel of the right palm, the accumulated geography of 10,000 repetitions. Not the random hardening of general labor, but the pointed, specific marking of a man who had been striking the same targets with precision for years. He was watching the wrestlers on the mat when DeLuca approached. He didn't turn until DeLuca was 8 feet away. And then he turned completely, not the half attention of someone interrupted, but the full, forward orientation of a man choosing to be fully present. Jimmy Woo made the introduction in English. "Carl, this is Bruce Lee. Bruce, Carl DeLuca, one of the best Greco-Roman wrestlers in the country." Bruce nodded once, said nothing. DeLuca extended his hand. And here is where it changes. Carl DeLuca didn't intend it as a challenge. That's the part people miss, and it matters. He extended his hand in the straightforward gesture of a man who respected other athletes, who had been raised to greet people directly and firmly. He was not performing. He was not testing. But the grip he applied was his natural grip, the grip of a man who had been gripping things, bars, ropes, wrists, shoulders, since childhood. The grip of a man whose hands could generate 240 pounds of crushing force per square inch, a number that had been measured during a training evaluation the previous year. When Carl DeLuca shook your hand, you knew you had shaken a wrestler's hand. He closed his fingers around Bruce Lee's right hand and applied pressure. Later, reconstructing the moment, DeLuca would say, "I wasn't trying to prove anything, but I also wasn't holding back. That's just how I shake hands." 43 people in the room. Probably a third of them were watching, in the loose peripheral way of men who are technically focused on their own conversations, but tracking everything. Among the watchers, Ray Medina, a UCLA wrestling coach who would later write about the evening, David Kwong, a Kempo instructor, and Emil Vrabel, DeLuca's own coach, who was seated on a bench near the far wall, unwrapping the tape from his wrists after his own session. For a fraction of a second, Bruce Lee received the grip. His hand did not move. His face did not change. He did not go rigid, did not attempt to pull away, did not attempt to match the pressure with counter-pressure, all of which would have been futile at the weight differential, all of which a trained wrestler would have read instantly and turned into a takedown opportunity. He simply received it. And then Jimmy Woo, who had been present, who had seen Bruce train, stepped forward and said quietly, "Carl, maybe not the grip." DeLuca, puzzled, glanced at Woo. His grip, still firm on Bruce's hand, had not released. Bruce Lee spoke for the first time. His voice was even, unhurried. He said, "Would you like to see what happened?" DeLuca blinked. What? What just happened? I can show it to you slowly, if you want." The room had already begun to shift its attention. The conversations near the mat had quieted by a degree. Emil Vrabel, on his bench across the room, looked up. DeLuca had two choices in that moment. He could release the hand, step back, and the evening would continue normally. He was a careful man. He was a methodical man. He could feel, dimly, that something had already happened that he hadn't fully registered. There had been a sensation in his wrist, subtle, the kind of sensation you notice at the edge of your awareness before logic dismisses it. Or he could find out. He was a wrestler. Finding out is what wrestlers do. "Show me," he said. Ray Medina, the UCLA coach, would write later that in the 12 seconds after that exchange, you could have heard a pin drop on the mat from 20 feet away. Bruce Lee asked DeLuca to grip his hand exactly as he had. The same force, the same fingers, the same application of pressure. DeLuca complied. The grip closed around Bruce's right hand, and DeLuca made no effort to lighten it. This was not a cooperative demonstration. The wrestler wanted to understand what had happened, and understanding required authenticity. In the first second, nothing visible happened. Bruce received the grip. His arm did not resist, did not go rigid. His shoulder dropped perhaps 2 degrees. The relaxation was so minimal that several witnesses later said they didn't see it at all. What DeLuca felt was stranger. The pressure he was applying seemed, suddenly, to find no resistance. Not because Bruce had gone weak, but because the architecture of resistance had subtly rearranged itself. It was like pressing your full weight against a door and finding, not that the door was locked, but that it had moved 2 inches in the direction you were pushing. Enough to eliminate the leverage you were counting on. That's not magic. That's centerline theory. In Wing Chun, the centerline is the vertical axis running through the center of the body, the spine, the sternum, the throat, the nose. Every technique is organized around protecting this line and attacking the opponents. But the centerline principle extends further. It governs how force is received, how it is redirected, how a smaller fighter refuses to oppose a larger fighter's strength directly and instead finds the geometry where that strength becomes irrelevant. Bruce had not resisted the grip. He had repositioned his center so that the grip, still applied at full force, was now pointing in a direction that DeLuca had not intended. In the second, Bruce's left hand rose, not fast, not dramatically, but with the economy of someone reaching for something on a shelf they use every day. It came to rest against DeLuca's forearm, not grabbing, not gripping, a contact point, 2 fingertips and a heel of palm, positioned at the ulnar nerve pathway on the outer forearm. 40 years later, DeLuca would describe this to a journalist. It wasn't a press. It wasn't a grab. It was more like someone placing a key in a lock. Exactly the right place. In the 3rd second, something traveled up DeLuca's arm. The best word he ever found for it was a wave, not pain. Exactly, but a disruption. The kind of sensation when you strike your funny bone, but localized differently. Running not down the arm but up it, toward the shoulder. His grip, which had been generating 240 pounds per square inch, which had pinned men against mats in front of national audiences, reduced itself involuntarily. His fingers did not release, but the architecture of the grip crumpled inward like a structure whose load-bearing element had been removed. And then Bruce's right hand, which had been gripped, rotated. The rotation was perhaps 15 degrees, a motion so small that several witnesses said they simply missed it. But the direction of that rotation, timed to the moment when the grip had lost its structural integrity, applied through the line of DeLuca's own extended arm, found the wrist joint at the precise angle where it could not resist without breaking. DeLuca's wrist went where it was sent. His wrist went where it was sent, and his body followed, because a body will always follow a joint that has been committed. The knee buckled. The hips dropped. 312 pounds of national caliber athlete found himself moving toward the floor in a controlled descent that he had not initiated, had not chosen, and crucially, could not stop without doing real damage to his wrist. He went down on one knee. He went down on one knee, and the room went completely silent. Not the silence of shock, the silence of comprehension that hasn't finished arriving yet. The way you hear something in a foreign language and understand. A full 3 seconds later, what was said? 43 people in a gym, and for 4 seconds, not one of them spoke, or coughed, or shifted weight. Emil Vrabel, on his bench across the room, lowered the tape he'd been unwrapping. He looked at his hands. He looked at the two men near the far wall, one standing, one on a knee. He said quietly, to no one in particular, "Huh." DeLuca was not hurt. Bruce had not applied the wrist lock to completion, had stopped the rotation at the point where the mechanics were demonstrated rather than the mechanics were imposed. DeLuca's knee was on the mat, but his body weight was still controlled, his spine straight, his face. And this is what Ray Medina noted specifically in his account. Not twisted with pain, but twisted with something else entirely. Not from pain, from realization. Bruce stepped back. One measured step backward. Hands returned to his sides. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at DeLuca with satisfaction or with triumph. He was looking at DeLuca's wrist with the focused attention of a craftsman, checking whether the joint had been positioned correctly. Concerned, the way a surgeon is concerned after a procedure, with whether the work had been done right. Did that hurt? Bruce asked. DeLuca, still on one knee, taking a moment before answering. No. Good. A pause. The same force would have broken it. He said it the way you state a technical fact, not a threat, not a boast. The observation of a man who has mapped the terrain and is simply describing the contour lines. DeLuca rose from his knee. The room exhaled. They moved to a corner of the gym, away from the group. That was DeLuca's instinct. He wanted to understand, and understanding required space. Bruce followed without ceremony, and for the next 20 minutes, while the rest of the gym drifted back to its conversations and its tape and its cooling down rituals, the two men stood together. DeLuca asked the obvious question first. How? How does 138 pounds do that to 312? Bruce thought for a moment before answering. He did not reach immediately for the technical vocabulary, did not begin with centerline theory or kinetic chain or any of the terminology he used when he was teaching formally. He began with something else. When you gripped my hand, he said, you were completely certain of what would happen next. That certainty lived in your arm. I could feel it, the direction of the force, the intention behind the grip. And a man who is certain about what happens next is not paying attention to what is actually happening. DeLuca turned this over. He was a smart man. He understood weight and leverage and force vectors at the practical level that competitive athletes develop without formal instruction. He said, you read the intention. The body announces itself before it acts. Bruce said, always. The question is whether you have learned to listen. This is the philosophical anchor at the center of everything Bruce Lee built. Not Jeet Kune do the style, not the one-inch punch the technique, not any specific deliverable, but this fundamental premise, that combat is a conversation, that force cannot be met with equal force without consequence, that the intelligent response to power is not resistance, but redirection. Be water, he would say. In interviews over the years that followed, water does not fight the stone. Water finds the space the stone cannot fill. DeLuca asked about the forearm contact, the two-finger touch that had disrupted his grip structural integrity. Bruce demonstrated it again slowly. DeLuca's arm extended. No grip applied. He showed the nerve pathway, the angle of the elbow joint that created temporary disruption without lasting damage. The clinical precision of it was remarkable. He was not a doctor, but he had studied the body with the same systematic intensity that a physician studies pathology, because in his practice, the body was the text. In wrestling, DeLuca said after a moment, we talk about reading the hips. The hips don't lie. If I can read where your hips are committed, I can predict the next 3 seconds of the match. Bruce nodded. Same principle. But faster. Everything is the same principle. Bruce said. Most of what separates styles is just the speed at which the principle is applied. DeLuca sat with that for a while. Around them, the gym was thinning out. Men packing bags, pulling on jackets, calling good nights across the room. Emil Vrabel had not left. He was still on his bench, not obviously watching, but not watching. At the end of the 20 minutes, DeLuca extended his hand again, the same hand Bruce had redirected onto a knee. He extended it in the straightforward way. Not a test this time, not a measurement. A handshake. Bruce took it. The grip between them, this time, was equal. Neither man applied pressure. 17 years of wrestling, DeLuca said, and that's the first time I understood what the grip was for. Bruce looked at him with something that was not quite a smile, but lived in the same neighborhood. You already knew, he said. You just hadn't had anyone explain it to you in that particular language. Vrabel, across the room, watched the handshake. He reached for his jacket. He said nothing, but he did not leave until the two men had finished speaking. Carl DeLuca competed in one more national championship, the 1968 Greco-Roman Nationals in Phoenix, Arizona, where he placed second. Then he retired from competitive wrestling at 27, which is young for a wrestler, but not unusual for a man who had been training since age 9. He became a coach. He coached at the University of Pittsburgh for 11 years. In that time, he produced 4 All-Americans and 1 national champion. The athletes who trained under him described his style as unusual for a wrestling coach. He spent enormous time on what DeLuca called receiving. Not just takedowns, not just pins, but the skill of receiving force. How to feel where a grip is going before it arrives. How to read the intention in an opponent's body before the body acts on it. He made us train slower than anyone else's team. One of his former wrestlers said in a 2004 oral history project on wrestling coaching methodology, slower than you thought you could go and still be learning. He said, speed is what happens when you've understood something completely. Until then, slow down and listen. DeLuca never became a student of Jeet Kune Do formally. He never sought out Bruce Lee again for training. Bruce died in July 1973, 3 years before DeLuca would have had the opportunity. And DeLuca had enough honesty about himself to know that what he'd received that October night was not a beginning but a confirmation. He had already been on the path. He had simply been shown, in 2 seconds and 1 redirected grip, the full length of the road. His students carried the lesson forward. Their students carry it still. In wrestling rooms from Pittsburgh to Albuquerque, there are athletes who have been taught to slow down, to listen, to receive before they react, who have been taught this by men who learned it from DeLuca, who learned it from a 138-pound man in street clothes on a Tuesday evening in Westwood. That's not a wrestling lesson. That's a physics lesson dressed in human clothing. Years later, in an interview, DeLuca was asked about the most important thing he learned in 17 years of competitive wrestling. He didn't answer immediately. He looked at his hands, the hands that had gripped 312 pounds of force-generating intention, that had been redirected with 2 fingers and 15 degrees of rotation, that had pressed a knee into a mat they didn't intend to touch. I learned, he said, that certainty is the enemy of attention. Return to the frozen moment, a gymnasium in Westwood, a Tuesday evening, a grip applied, 2 seconds. What Carl DeLuca experienced in those 2 seconds was not a defeat. A defeat requires a contest, and there was no contest, only a demonstration. What he experienced was the moment when 17 years of certainty met something older and stranger than certainty. The capacity to listen to force before answering it. 1 grip, 1 redirection, 1 lesson that changed the shape of how 40 years of athletes were taught to wrestle. Bruce Lee weighed 138 pounds. His wrist circumference measured 6.5 inches. His reach was 28 inches shorter than Carl DeLuca's. None of those numbers were obstacles. Every one of them was the lesson. 43 witnesses. 2 seconds. 1 principle that echoed through decades of athletes who never knew they were learning from a Tuesday night in a Westwood gym. But here's the question that remains, the one that DeLuca himself never fully answered. In that moment when he felt the grip's architecture dissolve, in the fraction of a second before his knee met the mat, did he try to stop it? He always said he didn't. He always said it happened too fast to intervene. But sometimes, watching his athletes train, watching them slow down, listen, receive, you get the feeling that there's a different version of that answer. One he kept for himself. There was one exchange Bruce Lee never spoke of publicly. Not to reporters, not to students, not in his training journals. And the reason why? What happened 3 months after that October evening, in a different city, with a different opponent, and a different kind of test entirely? That's a story for another time.